You have the witness.
Thank you, Mr. President. Are you ready, Lacey?
I am. Can you hear me now? Okay, there you go.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Do you have an exhibit in front of you, Lacey?
I do not have an exhibit in front of me. The screen is blank.
Defense has it, 623.
You did. I ignored you. That one.
Missy, can you give me the number on there, please?
Exhibit number 623.
Do you recognize the person on there?
I recognize the name, yes.
Do you recognize the photograph that's on that exhibit?
I recognize the photograph to be Ms. Laura Olson, yes.
Is that the person you saw at the Galaxy Cafe?
To the best of my belief, yes.
Is that the person that you know to have been having an affair with Ken Paxton?
Yes.
All right. Your Honor, at this time I would offer in evidence number 623.
I don't have a copy of the redacted one, or do we now? I'm not sure if we, is it 4 pages? Yes, Your Honor. It's in the sections of the packet. Okay, thank you. Is there any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Admit exhibit number 623 into evidence.
Thank you. The photograph that you took in your phone of the woman at the Galaxy that we now know to be Laura Olson, what did you do with it?
I deleted the photograph at the general's request.
Did he ask you to do that when you first talked with him about the woman?
He did.
When he told her it was his realtor?
He did.
All right. I want to come forward now to the summer of 2019. Were there continuing to be problems within the office, the type that we had talked about already?
Those problems began again, yes.
Okay. Who were you hearing from? I'm not asking you what they told you, but what people within the office were talking with you?
Travel aides, Mr. Mateer, the security detail.
Were there problems that were happening outside of Austin?
Yes.
All right. Was there a further conversation that you had with Ken Paxton concerning the affair?
Yes.
Did you learn that the affair was continuing?
From
Objection, speculation, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Thank you. Did you learn that it was continuing?
Objection, speculation, Your Honor, and anything that she
Been
would have learned.
ruled.
Let me finish,
It's
please.
been ruled.
Excuse me.
Anything
Sustained.
she might have learned, would it be based on hearsay or speculation?
Sustained.
Did you have a conversation with Ken Paxton during that time period?
I did.
That'd be the summer of 2019?
Correct.
Let's talk about that conversation. Where did it happen?
In my office on the 8th floor.
Did you initiate it or did he?
He did.
And what did you all talk about?
We talked about Miss Olson again.
And did you learn that the affair was continuing?
Yes.
Did he tell you that?
Yes.
How did he tell you that? What kind of voice was he using?
He was frantically upset.
At who?
I think he was frustrated, and he wanted to express to me that he was frustrated with me and that I didn't understand what he was trying to tell me. And he was trying to tell me, he came in and said he was frustrated and that I didn't understand. He still loved Mrs. Olson, and he wanted to work it out with me.
What did you take that to mean?
For me to be more accommodating as far as the security detail, the travel aides, any of his requests.
So in your very first conversation, when he first told you he was having an affair, had you given him some advice, some professional advice?
I did. I gave him ethics advice.
And what was that advice?
The ethics advice in 2018 was that when you try to keep things secret and you're a statewide elected official who's running for office, that it could be both ethically, legally, and morally challenging, and that it was beginning to bleed over into the office.
And is that what you were seeing?
Yes.
All right. Your second conversation in the summer of 2019, did you give him some similar advice?
I gave him the identical advice.
All right. Did you tell him that he needed to get his life in order so that the office could get back on track?
I did.
And leading and hearsay.
Sustained.
What did you tell him he should do?
Objection, hearsay.
It's not hearsay, Your Honor. She's the declarant, and Mr. Busby knows she's available for cross. He can have time with her when I'm
Overruled.
done. You can answer.
I told General Paxton quite bluntly that it wasn't my business who he was sleeping with, but that when things boiled over into the office and into the state work, that it had become my business, and that I was having concerns about how the time and the effort of the travel aides, the security detail, and myself was being spent.
And I want you to tell us what his demeanor was when you told him that.
He was angry with me.
How could you tell?
He raised his voice loud enough that it was heard outside my office, even though the door was shut. He was, his hands were waving. He was red in the face. He was upset with me.
How did that conversation end?
He stormed off out of my office. He ended the conversation.
Now, you mentioned that your duties had changed. Were you still managing all those different departments?
I was until September 1st of 2019. So at that time of the conversation, was still helping manage those departments.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit now about outside counsel contracts. Is that an area of your expertise?
It is. When I was the general counsel of the Office of the Attorney General, it was my duty to process those, read them, approve them. I wrote the administrative rules regarding those contracts. I wrote the contract form, so I'm very familiar with the outside counsel contract process.
In your time at the Attorney General's office, have you approved and actually evaluated a few or many of those contracts?
Thousands of those contracts.
All right, so you're very familiar with them.
I am.
Do people come and talk to you and ask questions about outside counsel contracts?
They do.
In fact, they ask you about a lot of things in that office, don't they?
They do.
All right. All right, I want to talk a little bit about the rules, because there are rules within the Office of Attorney General, are there not, for approving those contracts?
There's a procedure that's published on the agency's website, and there's also the Administrative Code, Texas Administrative Code 1 TAC, Chapter 57, that's related to outside counsel.
Let's talk just a minute about the procedure. Within the Office of Attorney General, when one of those contracts is being drafted up, what's the approval process, very quickly?
For a contract for the Office of Attorney General.
Yes.
Those contracts are generally initiated by the deputy that's interested in having the contract. It's routed through a sort of an audit procedure, which is called the Executive Approval Memo. Down in the General Counsel Division, the form is filled out with the pertinent information. There's a contract number that's established. It's put into a computer system, and it's reviewed for the requirements of the Appropriations Act and the rules.
Is there a requirement that there's some kind of finding concerning the best interest of the state?
I think what you're referring to is in the Appropriations Act, Article 9, Section 1601A. There's a requirement before you can spend appropriated funds on an outside counsel for the state. A determination needs to be sent in writing to the controller that the contract is in the best interest of the state and that can be paid.
Is there also a requirement that the attorney who's being hired be qualified
There is.
for the particular job at hand?
There is.
And do you have to have money allotted for the contract?
Yes, it helps.
part
It
of the
helps to have
procedure?
money allotted for the contract, yes.
All right. So you have
Unless the
to,
attorney's working for free, but
the forms that were used within the Attorney General's office during this time period, are they the forms that you designed?
they are.
And the procedure where everyone has to sign off, all the different levels, was that something that you worked up?
Something I was involved in working up, yes.
Okay. And it's computerized now. Was it always that way?
It was not. It used to be in paper with a routing sheet on top.
All right. Are applications for those types of contracts given identifying numbers when they're going through the process?
They are.
And is that important?
It's an important tracking mechanism to track the contract and that it's in the system and that it's approved, and it also allows the accounting division and the budget division to know which funds to pay that contract, which funds to direct the controller to pay the contract out of.
Missy, can you tell us when you first heard the name Nate Paul?
Not with precision. The first,
Ballpark.
probably 2019, and I heard that name come up in the weekly updates from David Maxwell and Mark Penley.
Were those at the meetings of all the deputy chiefs?
At times, and there were also private meetings at a regularly scheduled time with Mr. Mateer and myself and that particular deputy.
And what was the context of hearing that name? What was going on?
I was aware that at first,
Objection. I'm sorry, Your Honor, to interrupt. This is based on hearsay. Objection, hearsay.
Not offering it for the truth of
Sustained.
the... Missy, when you heard the name Nate Paul, what was it in context to?
Your
What
Honor,
was it
just-
related to?
Can I finish, please? It's the same question, hearsay. Objection.
I'm not offering it for the truth of the matter asserted. I'm trying to show the context in which she's known that name.
It's not an exception to the hearsay rule, Your Honor. It's hearsay.
Sustained.
When you heard the name of Nate Paul, did you do anything? Were you involved at all?
no, I was just listening
Okay.
to that updates.
At some point, did you become aware of a contract?
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay.
I'll
You
reword
just
it.
said she wasn't involved, and
I'll
she
reword
heard
it.
about it, so everything she knows about it, somebody told her.
I'll reword it. At some point, did you become aware of a contract that had been set aside for Brandon Kamek?
Yes,
When did you learn about that?
I recall being told,
Objection. I'm sorry, Miss. Your Honor, she's just telling us right now that everything she knows is hearsay.
I'll reword it.
Sustained.
Without telling us what somebody said, tell us first of all the time frame of when you became aware of it.
I'm just not sure I can tell you the exact time frame.
Okay, a ballpark's fine.
No, it's not, Your Honor. That's pure speculation. Ballpark is not good enough under oath in court.
Sustained.
Did you get a phone call from General Paxton about a contract for Brandon Kamek?
I did.
When did that happen?
September 28th of 2020.
All right. Where were you?
I was at my ranch in Mason, Texas. I got a call on my cell phone.
Okay. Was this COVID? Were you at home
I was.
working from home?
I was.
All right. The first contact you had, what was it from the general?
The Attorney General called and asked me for some advice, given my experience in the outside counsel world, about an outside counsel contract he was interested in entering into with Brandon Kamek. And so he called and asked me how the process worked.
And what did you tell him?
I told him how the process worked. We talked about the statute. We talked about the rules. We talked about the internal procedure of how it worked. He was interested in pursuing an outside counsel contract with him.
On September 28, did he make you aware that there had been a problem with the contract that was going through the office for signature, for approval?
He did.
Did he tell you who was holding it up?
He did.
Who did he tell you?
Mark Penley.
And did he ask you how to get that contract in effect without that signature from Mark Penley?
He did.
What did you tell him?
I told General Paxton that I believed, given my experience, that he, as the Attorney General, could sign an outside counsel contract with Mr. Kamek if he followed certain procedures that weren't able to be waived,
Okay.
which is the best interest standard in order to pay him. Then I also told him he could waive in writing based on 1 Texas Administrative Code, Section 52.7C, that if the Attorney General or the First Assistant waives the internal procedures in writing, then they can all be waived, the ones that aren't statutory or required by the Appropriations Act.
So the waiver can happen by the Attorney General or First Assistant, but it has to be in writing. Is that correct?
That's what the administrative rule says.
All right. You also mentioned that despite that, the standards of whether or not that contract is in the best interest of the state still applied. Is that correct?
Standard of whether the contract met the best interest of the state in order to be funded still applied, yes.
All right. So he can sign a contract on his own as long as he provides a written waiver. How about funding?
So at the Office of the Attorney General, there isn't an account set aside for outside counsel contracts. The money has to be moved from what is called the First Assistant's Reserve, which is some funding that's at the First Assistant's discretion. That money can be moved by in writing to the budget people and set aside the money. Then the money is coded and applied to the outside counsel contract.
So can be done, but should be done. Are those two different questions?
They are.
Did you talk with him about whether or not it should be done?
I did.
What did you tell him?
Since he had already told me that Mark Penley was refusing to sign, we talked about why that could be, that Mark Penley didn't want to sign, and why Jeff also did not want to sign, and that it was going to be really hard to get over the best interest standard until we resolve that, which is the funding part, not whether or not it was legal for the Attorney General to sign his own outside counsel contract.
Okay. How did he respond when you told him that?
He was very appreciative of the advice. He asked me if I could text him the statutes and the rules and the procedures so he could see what we were talking about, and I did that.
Before you hung up with him, did you tell him this was ill-advised?
I did.
Objection, leading.
Sustained.
What did you mean by ill-advised? In your opinion, what does that mean?
Your Honor, if I could, I mean, obviously you sustained the objection and now she's going right back at it and now testifying herself.
Would you sustain or would you
I'll reword it.
reword it?
When you advise someone that a contract shouldn't be done, can be done, but shouldn't be done, how did you tell him?
I would have used the word ill-advised. That's just kind of a word I use.
And did you tell him why it was ill-advised?
I did.
What did you tell him?
I told him that his senior staff felt like that this contract was a problem and they didn't want him to do it, and that we needed to resolve that and be on the same page.
Okay. Were there was there continued contact from Ken Paxton concerning this contract?
He emailed me back the next morning after I sent him the stuff in writing and said he appreciated it. He did call me back again the next day, a couple hours later, and we had the conversation again. We talked about all these same things again. Then I think he might have reached out to me on October the 1st, but I did not return that call.
Okay. That last phone call you had with him, what was the content of it?
It was very similar to the content of the first conversation.
So he wanted to know how he could do it?
Follow-up questions about, now, didn't you say that I could do it this way or that way? And we went through that again, and how the funding worked again, and how to make it happen.
That last phone call that you had with him about how to make it happen, did you talk with him again about why he shouldn't make it happen?
My recollection is I was much firmer on how strongly the executive team felt that it was ill-advised.
Okay. I wanted to talk about his demeanor on the telephone during that particular phone call. Would you describe it?
The second phone call,
Yes.
His demeanor, it was like I was on speakerphone and somebody else was listening, which concerned me.
Why did you think that?
Your Honor, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to object. This is rank speculation, and I object under 602.
Overruled.
You've known him for how many years?
Since 2015,
You've known him through good times and bad times?
I have.
Tell us, based on your knowledge of him, what your impressions were of that phone call, of his demeanor.
It was unusual. It was like I was speaking to somebody besides him, because he's very bright and he knew exactly what we had talked about the day before. And it was a repeat of the same thing, like I was playing to an audience.
Did you think that it was a phone call where it was a private phone call, like telephone to ear?
Objection again, Your Honor. This is speculation. She doesn't know if anybody was there with him, and she's just speculating.
I'll ask it a little differently.
Yes.
Did
Rephrase.
you have an impression that you were not on a direct private telephone line with Ken Paxton at that time?
I was concerned about that, yes.
What did you think?
Again, Your Honor, what she thought is irrelevant, and it's also speculation.
Sustained.
That phone call obviously made you very uncomfortable. You've said that. What about it made you uncomfortable?
General Paxton's persistence to do this, knowing his senior staff objected, which was very unusual. And it was also unusual to me that he chose to call me and talk to me about it, since we were not on the best of terms.
Let's talk a little bit about these types of contracts. To create a contract and assign responsibility to an outside attorney, are there certain parameters and limitations?
So the outside counsel process was designed in order to protect and preserve the Attorney General's office's constitutional and statutory duties to represent the state. So necessarily, a grant of an outside counsel approval is a granting that in the first instance, those activities would have been within the course and scope of something the Attorney General's office could do, if that makes sense.
And are the scope of duties of the Attorney General's office lined up with civil law? In other words, are they civil properties?
I mean, it's civil. There's civil parts of it. There's also the ability of the Attorney General's office to assist prosecutors on request.
Okay.
If that's what you're asking.
That's what I'm asking.
Okay.
So talk with me for just a minute about how we get to prosecution. What has to happen? What has to happen for the Attorney General's office to be able to prosecute legally?
Well, if the Attorney General's office wasn't provided statutory authority by the legislature to have sole prosecutorial authority in the area, those sorts of questions are ones that come from a request by a constitutional district attorney or county attorney for assistance as a general rule.
Okay. So can the district attorney limit the scope of the ability of the office to do that kind of work?
I'm sure they can. They pick and choose what they decide to send over and what they ask for.
During all the years you were at the AG's office, have you ever seen the Office of Attorney General hire outside counsel to handle a criminal item?
I don't recall hiring outside counsel to handle a criminal item.
Are those large divisions within the office?
Some of them are larger than others, but we have prosecutors on staff, we have peace officers on staff.
So they're qualified people within the Attorney General's office to handle those types of things?
Yes.
Okay. I want to talk about the contract, in particular, the CAMIC contract. Have you seen it? Have you been able to look at it?
I have seen it.
All right. I want to talk about the contents of that. The limitations were provided on that contract, were they not? Was there an
Yes.
addendum A that?
Addendum A is generally the scope of work that the outside counsel is being requested. That's how it's set up in the form.
Okay, and based on your research, what did that addendum A track? What language was that?
Can you show it to me, please, ma'am?
See, 227, please. It's in evidence.
If I could see addendum A, please, ma'am.
We need addendum A, please.
I have it.
Whoops.
Thank you.
Yeah. Do you recall looking at that language?
I have read this language before, yes, ma'am.
And was that language tracked from the Travis County District Attorney's Office referral letter? Did you take a look at that?
It appears to be very similar.
Okay. And is it a limiting type of language?
I mean, I think by its nature, all scope of services are limiting in their language.
This particular contract, though, does it give?
Your Honor, I have to object. Can we get some foundation here? She was not involved in this other than the phone call she just talked about. And we heard Ryan Vassar, who drafted this. So this is all something she learned later, and she shouldn't be up there testifying about it.
Missy, do you have a lot of experience in
Sustained.
these contracts?
I'm talking about this particular contract, Your Honor. She just asked it again. This witness was not involved in the drafting of this contract.
This witness does not have to be involved in the drafting of the contract to give an opinion concerning it or to talk about it. That's not required under the law.
Moreover, and thank you for that. Moreover, Your Honor, now she's asking her to give some sort of legal opinion, which certainly she's not been proffered as an expert. They don't have any experts in this case.
She's a person who teaches. This is an area of her expertise. She's talked about the thousands of contracts that she's
Okay,
looked at
let
and
me just
approved.
settle this. I'm going to overrule. Continue.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Can you repeat the
Take a look
question?
at Addendum A, and there's a limitation in there concerning the ability to do what? What is it authorizing Brandon Kamick to do?
Let me take a second to reread it, please.
Certainly.
The contract provides that pursuant to a request basically from the Travis County District Attorney's Office, that the outside counsel will conduct an investigation under the authority of the Attorney General's Office of the criminal allegations contained in the complaint.
It says to conduct a review, does it not, in the very
does.
first paragraph
It does, a review and
of the allegations?
a review of the allegations, and then the third paragraph, conduct an investigation.
Okay. Does that particular contract authorize prosecution of a case?
The last sentence in the contract excludes legal services relating to post-investigation activities, including but not limited to indictment and prosecution.
So it excludes that.
Correct.
All right. I want to talk about this contract that you were consulted about by Ken Paxton himself. Is there a problem with Ken Paxton signing a contract like this to provide services when he's authorized him at least 2 weeks ahead of time to start providing those services?
I have never been made personally aware of when Ken Paxton signed this contract, so I don't think I can answer your question.
So what I'm asking you is, if he had authorized Brandon Kamick 2
Your Honor,
weeks earlier,
I'm
let me
sorry.
finish my question, please.
There's no reason to yell. Your Honor, I'm sorry, I have to object. That counsel is putting facts that are not in evidence. The witness has already told us she has no personal knowledge. This is completely improper, and I object.
She is an employee who's familiar with the procedures and whether or not things are proper or not. In fact, she's being consulted about it, so I think I'm entitled to ask her.
Overruled.
Thank you.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Is there a problem if the contract was signed by Ken Paxton and he had authorized the services to be performed weeks ahead of time, before that date of signature?
The contract should have, in the first pages, an effective date of the contract. And I don't have in front of me what those effective dates were, but the effective dates need to line up. It's not the time of signature, it's the effective date of the contract. But there's still the problem of the funding. It's unresolved.
What if there's no date at all because it's not been put on there?
Then I would be speculating as to whether or not the contract was signed before the date of the effective date of the work.
Okay. Assuming that your advice to General Paxton about his ability to sign it under that little provision, would it be properly done if he did not provide a written waiver?
If he did not provide the written waiver required by the rules, then the procedure should have been followed.
Okay, so you either follow the procedures or you have to sign it and give a written waiver as the Attorney General. Is that correct?
That's the process.
All right, so without that written waiver, where are we?
It's merely a violation of the process. It doesn't make it illegal, it just makes it a violation of the process.
How about funding it? What does it do to that?
Without the proper written indicators to the controller, they're not going to pay the invoices,
Okay.
even if the money's there.
The Addendum A talks about a referral from the Travis County District Attorney's Office. If General Paxton had added a second referral and told Brandon Kamick just do the whole job, is there a problem with that, with a contract that's not authorizing the work to be done?
I don't know that I'm comfortable speculating to that.
Then I object, Your Honor. The witness has admitted, thank you, that this would be all speculation.
Sustained.
What are your thoughts on that?
Your Honor.
I'd like to let her finish the thought, as far as she's not rendering an opinion, but I'd like her thoughts on it.
Again, Your Honor, she just said this would be mere speculation, so this is improper.
Sustained. Sustained.
Are you familiar with the attorney applicants who applied for this particular contract?
I'm familiar with their names.
Okay.
I do not know them.
Was Brandon Kamick the qualified candidate?
I don't think I was ever asked to weigh into that question.
Not asking you that. Having looked at all these contracts and you've said you have to have a qualified candidate for the job, looking at those two, was Brandon Kamick the qualified applicant for it? Was he the best choice?
It was not my decision to make who the best choice was.
Not asking that, I'm asking your opinion as you sit here today.
Asked and answered, I think.
Would it ever be in the best interest of the state to pay for a free investigation to a private citizen when there's no state interest involved?
So you're hypothetically asking me if it's
I am.
proper to execute an outside counsel at $0 for an investigation where there's no state interest involved at all.
Correct.
I'm not sure it's possible to execute an outside counsel contract where there's no state interest involved, because the ability to contract with an outside counsel derives from the ability of the Attorney General's office to represent a particular client in a particular matter.
We're talking about a cost, right? We're paying somebody other than an in-house attorney from the OAG to do the work requested, correct?
Statute, the government code in 402-0212 that describes outside counsel talks about the full-time employees of an agency don't count against as being outside counsel.
Right.
It's when you hire a counsel that's not employed by the state.
So my question is, when you're paying someone like Brandon Kamick outside of the state to provide services that benefit only one individual for a job that is not in the best interest of the state, do we have a good contract?
I'm sorry, Your Honor, objection vague. Question's completely vague.
Sustained.
You said that In order for a contract to be approved and signed from the Office of Attorney General for an outside counsel, the whole contract has to be in the best interest of the state, right?
Yes, I mean, that would be ideal. It's not because that comes from the Appropriations Act, but the state should not perform acts with taxpayer dollars that are not in the best interest of the state, in my opinion.
Right. And so if it's a job that's only going to benefit a citizen and has nothing grounded within a state interest, that's not a contract that should be approved, is it?
Objection leading.
Sustained.
Is that the type of contract that we want? That we should
Objection.
be approving?
I'm sorry, I don't know who "we" is, but objection vague.
Sustained.
Let's talk about September 28th. That afternoon, after you spoke with Ken Paxton about this contract, did your phone start blowing up?
I talked to General Paxton, I believe those phone calls were in the evening on the 28th, not in the morning.
And
And
who
so-
were you getting the phone calls from?
So when General Paxton called me, because he hadn't looped me into his world in a while, I did call Jeff Mateer before I called him back, and Jeff relayed, said,
Objection, hearsay.
Sustained.
Later on that evening, who did you speak with?
Mr. Mateer.
Did you speak with anyone else other than him?
After I spoke to General Paxton, I don't believe so. It was late.
Okay. Following day, did you receive some phone calls from other people within the office?
I did.
Who did you hear from?
I think there was sort of there was all involved deputies call with a number of the deputies that's been previously reported on that I was on the telephone for.
Okay. And how long were you on the phone? What kind
Hours.
of time frame? All right. How many of you were on that call?
I mean, I would say 6 to 8 of us at various times, sometimes up to 10, and people were in and out of the call.
What was going on?
There had been some subpoenas issued by Mr. Kamek that some of the staff had known about and reported, and the deputies were getting together with Mr. Mateer to discuss those facts and the circumstances around what was happening at the time
Okay.
with him.
Was Nate Paul at the center of that conversation?
Objection, hearsay.
Topic. I'm not asking her to repeat what was said.
Overruled.
Was Nate Paul the topic?
Yes,
Did you learn about several things that had been going on in the office?
yes.
Any idea why you were not aware of those things before that date?
I believe that due to COVID and everyone being home and not on the same floor working together and people coming in and out on different days of the office in the middle of the pandemic, we were not all together at that time as a team in the same place at the same time. And so there wasn't complete awareness like there usually would have been of what each deputy was working on with relation to Mr. Paul and General Paxton.
So as a result of that long phone call with the group, did you come to learn, I'm not asking you to repeat, but did you come to learn about those things that had been happening within the office?
I did.
And what was the connecting theme of those things?
Mr. Paul.
All right. As a person who's spent so many years worrying about ethics and how things should be managed within a government office, what were your thoughts about what was going on?
I was surprised at the level of involvement from the Attorney General with one particular person that reached across so many levels of the executive staff, all related to one person.
In the course of your career, have you ever experienced something like that before?
Not related to a particular person as opposed to a particular topic.
Okay. Tell us what your concern was ethically with what had happened.
I learned that the contract was executed, even though the conversations I was having with General Paxton, he never told me that the contract was already executed. We were approaching the conversations as if it was not a fait accompli and had not been done. So I was very surprised by that. And I was surprised by how many different things related back to a use of resources by the agency for one person.
So, what's the big deal with that? Who cares?
Objection, Your Honor. I mean, I
What's
don't know
the
what that
deal?
is. That's not a question. It's not a proper question. I object to it.
Sustained.
What's the problem with all of those resources going to one person?
Besides it being unusual, it was unusual, and there was a lot of speculation about the underlying reasons during that phone call.
Okay. Was there any resolution with that phone call? Was there a decision to do something?
On the 29th,
Yes.
there was not.
How about the 30th, the next day?
There was.
And what did you decide to do? What did the group decide to do?
The group felt like, some of the group felt like they had an obligation to report to law enforcement.
Why would they do that? What was the problem
Objection,
with?
speculation. She's asking about people we've already heard from. Tell us what they were thinking. We've heard from them.
I'll reword it.
Sustained.
I'll reword it. At this point in time, what was the problem with what had been going on? What was the concern in your mind?
A concern in my mind was the immense amount of effort that was being put to the problems of one particular individual when so many of the executive staff disagreed with that. And I'm a consensus builder, and there was not consensus on how to move forward on these things.
Was it the degree of that?
Objection,
amount?
leading.
Sustained.
When you looked at all of the events that you learned about, and you looked at the people that had been involved with it, did you, in your mind, figure out how much of the office had actually been dedicated to doing work for Nate Paul's benefit?
I did.
What kind of number did you come up with? How did you describe it?
I think at the time I mentally came up, it was more than 50% of the deputies' time of our entire executive staff.
You ever seen anything like that in your career?
I had not.
All for the benefit of who?
I don't know that I can answer who it was for the benefit of. What I can answer is the commonality
Objection.
and the thread.
Sorry, ma'am. The witness just told us she can't answer the question. Next question.
And what was
Sustained.
what was the commonality of it that you were about to talk about?
Nate Paul was the commonality.
All right. And the other commonality would be who directed it, and who is that?
Attorney General Paxton.
When the Attorney General's office does something that totally violates its long-time policy, for example, something like open records and not disclosing information for pending law enforcement, honoring the law enforcement exception, and not releasing documents that have to do with ongoing criminal investigations, what's the effect? What kind of things happen to the office and to the public?
Your Honor, that is a completely improper question. This person is not even involved in public information at the office. Moreover, the question is 3 or 4 different questions.
Sustained.
It's improper.
Do you have experience in open records?
I do. I was the public information coordinator for the Office of Attorney General. I was the division chief of the division, and at the time that you're asking about, I was the supervisor of the public information officer for the Office of the Attorney General who had briefed that particular ruling to the Open Records Division.
So when you violate the policy, the long-standing policy to protect that type of information, what does it do?
Your Honor, that assumes, she just said she approved this, and now the lawyer is saying that she violated some policy. That's improper.
That's incorrect. I've not said anything
Overruled.
like that. What's the long-term effect? What happens? What's the concern?
When the Open Records Division changes long-standing precedent in their rulings, it can create confusion, and it is a proactive statement of precedent on other rulings in that area.
And when it's broken, what does that mean? That precedent's gone.
All the governmental agencies have to adapt to that new precedent across the board with every request that's similar.
Did you go with the others to the FBI?
I did not.
Why not?
I had retired, and so I did not. I was invited to the meeting, and I was 3 hours away, and the meeting, I was told that unless you came in person, don't come.
Did you have an occasion later on to go talk with the FBI about your observations?
I was subpoenaed by the grand jury to talk about my observations in 2021.
Okay. And did you do that?
I did.
Did you
I
cooperate?
complied with the lawful subpoena.
And your name is not on the whistleblower letter, is that correct?
I am not a whistleblower
Why is that? Why did you not sign the letter?
because I had, when the time all this was happening, I had already submitted my notice to retire, and my retirement was imminent. So, for lack of a better word, I was a quitter. I had quit.
Pass the witness.